In 2023, there was something of a minor furore over the number of young people conceding bin Laden's charges of American transgressions against Muslims in the United States foreign policy. For all the attention Letter was getting 21 years after its publication, and for all the furious conservative backlash, the most interesting part of the letter seems to have been entirely neglected. This is the section in which bin Laden justifies the indiscriminate killings of American citizens, such as occurred on September 11th, 2001. In this portion of the text, bin Laden reasons that the American people freely choose their leaders, and thus American foreign policy reflects the will of the American people. Were the American people in disagreement with the policies of the American state, they would vote for leaders with different policies. This they consistently fail to do. The use of American taxpayers' money on weapons deployed against Muslims, argues bin Laden, is consented to by said taxpayers, since they elect the representatives who decide on how to spend the aforementioned money. Since the American people authorize this aggression, they are legitimate targets of violence. Is bin Laden wrong? More precisely, how can we believe in liberal democracy and at the same time say that he is wrong? How can one insist that in democracy it is the people who rule, that policy reflects the people's will, and yet the people are not responsible for the outcomes of policy? If bin Laden is in fact correct and the United States is aggressing against Muslims, why are any and all US citizens not legitimate targets for reprisal? Perhaps the choice of example makes this argument unpalatable to my viewers. Very well, let us take another example. The October 7th attacks against Israel were perpetrated by Hamas against Israelis. In 2006, a majority of people in Gaza voted for Hamas. Is the mass killing and starvation of people in Gaza since October 7th therefore justified? Indeed, just such claims have been made in Israel. Hitler also came to power by the liberal democratic mechanism. Does this justify the ethnic cleansing of Prussia, or what is today called Kaliningrad? Perhaps the reply to this would be that most Palestinians alive today were not of voting age in 2006, or that Hamas and the National Socialists abolished free elections after their respective ascents to power. Would generalized aggression against Palestinians and Germans be justified so long as the individuals in question were of voting age at the time of the relevant elections? The second objection is equally dubious. Abolition of liberal democracy is consistent with Hamas's ideology, and it was practically a campaign pledge of Hitler. One wonders why the people are judged to be the supreme arbiters of everything, of all policy, but are not competent to abolish elections. If they are not competent in one area of policy, why are they infallible in all other areas? Even if the point regarding elections is conceded, what if Hamas and the National Socialists had continued to hold elections? Would mass killings of civilians then be justified? By the same token, why were the October 7th massacres unjustified? Israel holds regular free elections, and most of those killed were above voting age. In all likelihood, my viewers are currently objecting that elections are not unanimous. The representatives who form governments are elected by majorities, and so for any given policy there will be a large proportion of the citizenry that voted against it. Beerbohm has, in fact, argued that voting against an unjust policy absolves voters of moral responsibility for said policy. The problem with this argument is that it ignores the central legitimacy claim of liberal democracy. I have already detailed this in an earlier video, but to recapitulate, democracy is rule by the people. The people is a unitary actor. It has a single will, or else the idea that a government could enact the will of the people would be unintelligible. How the will of the people is determined depends on how one conceives of the people, which itself is ideologically determined. Fascists understand the people in terms of the nation, communists in terms of the class, and liberals in terms of the individual. Liberal democracy determines the will of the people by the aggregation of individual wills through voting. The rub of this is that it means that the wills of those in the losing majority are taken to be included in the resultant will of the people. By the very act of voting, by the very possession of a vote, citizens consent to the final decision. This is what is meant by the oft-referenced assertion in the US Constitution that governments are instituted among men deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That this means that dissenting minorities consent to the outcomes of elections is explicitly argued by the father of liberalism and chief influence on the founding fathers of America, John Locke. His pronouncements on the matter are worth quoting in full. I quote, "Men being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be political power of another without his consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite in a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one among another, in a secure enjoyment of their property and a greater security against any that are not of it. When any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. For when any number of men have, by the consent of every individual, made a community, they have thereby made that community one body, with a power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determination of the majority. For that which acts any community, being only the consent of the individuals of it, and it being necessary to that which is one body to move one way, it is necessary the body should move that way whither the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority, or else it is impossible it should act or continue one body, one community, which the consent of every individual that united into it agreed that it should, and so everyone is bound by that consent to be concluded by the majority. And therefore we see that in assemblies empowered to act by positive laws, where no number is set by that positive law which empowers them, the act of the majority passes for the act of the whole, and of course determines as having by the law of nature and reason the power of the whole, and thus every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to everyone of that society to submit to the determination of the majority, and to be concluded by it, or else this original compact, whereby he with others incorporates into one society, would signify nothing, and be no compact, if he be left free and under no other ties than he was before in the state of nature. For the consent of the majority shall not in reason be conceived as the act of the whole, and conclude every individual. Nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything to be the act of the whole. But such a consent is next to impossible ever to be had, if we consider the infirmities of health and avocations of business, which in a number, though much less than that of a commonwealth, will necessarily keep many away from the public assembly, to which if we add the variety of opinions and contraries of interest which unavoidably happen in all collections of men, the coming into society upon such terms would be only like Cato's coming into the theatre only to go out again." End quote. If this were not so, why would dissenting minorities be bound to acknowledge the legitimacy of the elected? What argument is there within the liberal democratic framework that dissenting minorities are required to follow laws decided by majority decision? It is obvious that liberal democracies do expect dissenting minorities to obey the majority decision. If the notion that democracy is governed by consent of the governed is to retain any meaning, it must be accepted that the wills of the dissenting minority are incorporated into the will of the majority. The alternative is that the minority is simply oppressed after every election and is under no ethical obligation to acknowledge the authority of elected representatives or the validity of their laws. What are the moral implications of this? Let us make this very personal and plain. You, my viewer, likely believe that your state is committing some injustice. Assuming you live in a liberal democracy, then I have to inform you that you have consented to this injustice. You are, in fact, responsible for it. This injustice was an expression of the people, of which you are part. If you are an American or a Brit, it is likely your state has undertaken a war which you find to be criminal. For example, the invasion of Iraq, bombing campaigns in Syria and Libya, or supporting Israel's war in Gaza. Well, you assented to it. You have blood on your hands. How does it feel to be vermin? Bin Laden was right. You should be killed. Does this sound right? In all likelihood, you find the agreement I've just made revolting and unfair, even if you can't articulate why. This is because you have been indoctrinated your whole life to equate the democratic with the good, and being faced with democratic logic leading to a repugnant outcome causes you a fair degree of cognitive dissonance. An unpleasant sensation, isn't it? The purpose of the preceding exercise is to shock you out of your democratic conditioning. If liberal democracy has such a major flaw, then one really should question liberal democracy, shouldn't one? Sure, you could make an instrumental defense of liberal democracy, what I call the Churchill response, but you must abandon the argument that liberal democracy is a good in itself. Whatever instrumental value the liberal democratic mechanism of free and fair voting may have, you cannot argue that liberal democracy is a good in itself without endorsing the Bin Laden argument. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi. Links in the description.